What's up guys? So I finally had the chance to try out the new characters and wanted to update my tier list. The difference this time being that I made two separate tier lists, one for the early to mid game and the other for the late game. In the early to mid game, players are mainly focused on progressing in adventure mode, whereas in the late game, players are focusing more on raid, which is where the majority of your major resources will come from. This will be why the two lists may look similar in some ways, but vastly different in others. You can think of the one on the left being an adventure mode tier list, and the one on the right as everything else. The design of the beginner tier list is to give you an idea as to which characters will help you best beat it quickly. Keep in mind the characters that are best early game may not be the best late game, which you will see later in the late game tier list. So just take a look at the two tier lists I've made, and make your own conclusion as to who you want to develop more. Starting off with the beginner tier list, let's say you've just started the game. This is who I think the best characters are for clearing adventure mode. To preface this, I want to say there are many pathways you can take to clear difficult stages. The most recent meta has been building an all-warrior team that includes Theseus. This calls for a very damaging team, but this strategy falls off late game as the only healer, Mia, fails to heal everyone sufficiently. The other strategy is what I call the brute force strategy, or the standard strategy. This involves getting as many top tier characters as you can, and just going through the stages as you would casually. Picking out the strongest burst damage characters like Ymir, Ice, and Irie, and just using everything you have on the boss. There are many more strategies that I have not mentioned, but these are the main ones I wanted to mention today. With that out of the way, let's quickly look down the list. For a more detailed breakdown of each character, please watch my previous tier list as I don't want to repeat myself again too much. I will also provide additional details in the video description as to what the characters are useful for. In SS tier you have Mia, who is a DPS, healer, and tank all in one package. Her utility will speak for itself, and as a result, she is in a class of her own in the SS tier. Following that, you have Irie, Yui, Ymir, and Ice. Irie, Ymir, and Ice all do amazing damage in addition to having some very useful passive skills. Irie's burst skill dishes out crazy physical damage similar to Ice. Ice is able to match if not do more damage thanks to her added penetration. To complement this physical damage, you have Ymir, who is one of the strongest mages in the game, whose burst skill also provides a shield to the team. Next up are characters in A tier who can dish out great damage, but they either do less damage than those in S tier, or they have slightly less versatility. All these characters, which include Kana, Dark Lord, Theseus, Ryu, and Bell, do very good damage in most situations, and for some of them, only certain situations. For example, Dark Lord deals amazing bonus damage to dark type enemies, whereas Theseus deals devastating attacks to enemies with a fire related immunity. Not to mention he also makes the full warrior team a viable team comp for most adventure mode. Kana and Bell are useful fire type characters who can deal considerable fire physical damage, typically more damage than most characters in the tiers below them. Ryu feels the necessity of a leaf mage, so she's your only option when you need to deal leaf magic damage. In summary of the A tier, these characters can deal out devastating damage in certain scenarios, whereas S tier characters will be useful in majority of scenarios. This is why Ryu and Bell are below Ice when it comes to new players. Next up is the B tier, and I will say that B and C tier are not necessary for new players, but if you don't have anything better, then they are fine. Each one of these characters serves a useful role which only happens every now and then. Kairon does great damage but requires high crit rate in order to do so. Vivian is a useful tank who will make any team more sustainable, and can synergize well in most teams. Rosie is a little underrated in my opinion, but her usefulness mainly shows when you use her in conjunction with an S tier character to burst down an adventure boss. She pretty much just buffs her teammate's active skill considerably, and this may be the extra edge you need to burst down adventure bosses who tend to not have that much health relative to the boss's outside adventure. Ares is another warrior that does amazing damage and synergizes well with full warrior teams, though he doesn't have much team utility outside being just a heavy hitter himself. Next up is the C tier. Again, none of these characters are going to make or break beating a wall in adventure mode when compared to those above them, but the average free-to-play casual player will still be able to find moderate success with them. They just won't be able to easily breeze through everything effortlessly. If you want to learn more about them, then feel free to watch my previous tier list. For the majority of them, they can excel in one or two situations and are considered very niche. In addition, many of their damage capabilities are far behind those in the top tiers, so that is why I cannot fully recommend them for the sake of clearing adventure mode. Where you may see some of these ranks change is when I talk about the late game tier list next, which focuses more on raids and some other late game content. First up is Mia in SS tier. She is in every single one of my teams in the late game, so no surprise she is in a class of her own again. Following her are Yui and Ymir in the A tier. Yui is still the strongest single target healer, and Ymir is still the strongest mage with the most utility, so they are still essential characters you'll want to max out in the late game. What's different is that I moved Irie and Ice down a tier. Although Irie does a ton of damage with her burst, her passive skills aren't as useful as Yui and Ymir above her. Because she is still incredibly strong for the majority of game modes, she holds a spot in the A tier. Ice is also here because of her incredible burst damage. She is also useful for maybe 1 or 2 raids, and will become essential in late game guild territory and Dark Lord's Tower where your team will need the added crit resistance. You'll see that Ryu is also in the same tier as Irie and Ice. Not only because I'm biased, but her active skill does great damage and has a very long skill animation, which can stall for other teammates' skills to cool down. This will prove useful in lots of late game battles. You will also notice that I moved many characters from the A tier in the beginner tier list to the B and even C tier for the late game tier list. Here's what the B and C tier represent for me in the late game. B tier represents characters who are going to be essential in specific situations. Because their usage requires specific scenarios, they drop down in the tier list due to that lack of versatility. But don't get me wrong, they're all very viable characters in addition to those in C tier. For instance, you're going to need characters like Aina, Joan, Gaia, and Ryu to reduce elemental damages in raid. Additionally, you'll need characters for late game Dark Lord's Tower and guild territory such as Kairon, Ares, Rosie, Theseus, and Ice. In order to defeat some of those very late game stages, you will need these characters in B tier. Now with those in C tier, these are the characters that I felt if I didn't have them, I can still survive playing the game without. Not having one of them is not going to hinder my gaming experience that much. You can argue most of these characters have close substitutes in the higher tiers, and as a result are non-essential. But don't worry, even if they are your only 5 stars, you can still be a very successful sword master. I wanted to keep this video short, so I apologize if I skipped over any characters you were hoping to hear about. Truth is, if they are lower on the tier list, then you probably shouldn't worry about them anyways. I at least wanted to get my opinion out there about those who I think are worthy of pulling and investing in. To save some time, I'll go ahead and post additional details and explanations of my rankings in the video description below. Please don't view this tier list as an end-all be-all list, as it really is just my opinion, and many of the rankings I have put out can easily be in another tier depending on your use case. Also know that characters can be buffed or nerfed in the future, so this list is subject to change. At the very least, I hope some of this was useful, especially to the newer players. I know there will be a lot of disagreements, and that's totally fine. In that case, you can make your own tier list. If you guys found use out of the video, then please give it a like, and if you have further questions, just ask me in the comments below. Thanks again for watching, and as always, I'll see you in the next one.